So in the previous tutorial I showed you how to create this plant in Blender. If you haven't watched that video, you can watch that by clicking the I button. But in the previous tutorial I didn't show you how to create the materials, so let's create the materials. And everything is looking messed up, so I'm gonna select these bounds and I'm gonna move on to a new collection. Then I'm gonna hide that collection. These are left, so I'm gonna select these and I'm gonna move these also. Then I'm gonna go to rendered view and I'm gonna deselect these two options to light the scene with an HDRI. So let's start with the leaf material. And to be honest, it looks like paper and it doesn't look that good. And the reason is because we are only using one image texture which is driving the color of our material. So to make photorealistic material, we should use PBR maps, which stands for physically based rendering. And instead of giving you only one base color image texture, it also gives you multiple textures that can be used to define the various properties of a material. Like the roughness map is used to define the roughness of the material, and the normal map is used to fake the small details that doesn't affect the geometry but only appear in the render. And there are many more textures like the displacement texture, metalness, ambient occlusion, but to give you an example I only shared you these three textures. And the roughness map is a black and white image texture which is used to define the roughness of the material. And if you don't know, black color equals to 0, which will have a roughness of the value 0, that means the material will be shiny. And the white color equals to the value of 1, which means the material will have a roughness of level 1, which means it will be rough. So wherever you see these darker colors, it means the material will be shiny over here, and wherever you see the lighter colors, it means the material will be rough over there. So now the problem is that we only have one image texture. So now I'm gonna give you a quick and cheap method that you can use to make your materials better with only one image texture. I'm gonna give myself a little bit more space. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna add a color ramp, then plug the color into this vector and make sure that you have enabled the node wrangler add-on, which you should always enable. And now you can preview any node by holding Ctrl Shift and left clicking on that, and now you can see that the color ramp has converted our image texture into a black and white image. And to preview the material again, you have to hold Ctrl Shift and left click on the principal BSDF. And now what I'll do, instead of this slider to change the roughness of our material, what I'll do is I'll connect this color ramp to the roughness so that the black and white image texture is driving the roughness. I'm gonna smooth shade my leaf, and now you can move these sliders to make your image brighter or darker. So what I'll do is I'm gonna move this to the left and I'm gonna move this to the right, and you can see that the transition is now sharper between the colors. And you can also make these darker values brighter so the material is not that shiny. Something like this is good. And I can also make this a little bit darker so it's not that rough. And now let's see. I'm gonna select look dev mode for real-time rendering. I'm gonna make this brighter. I'm gonna move this over here, and you can play with these sliders until you get the effect. And now you can see the effect. You can see that it's shiny over here and it's rough over here, and now it's looking better. And now to add fake details to this material, what I'll do is I'm gonna add a bump node, then connect the normal to the normal and this color, to this height input, and the strength is pretty high and that doesn't look good, so I'm going to decrease that down to something like 0.3. And now you can see the details. This is before and this is after. And when you look at the back of the leaf, you can see that it's pretty dark over here, but when light hits through the leaf, you can see this translucency effect, which looks pretty cool. So to make that effect, I'm gonna add a translucent BSDF, then add an add shader, then connect this up to the bottom socket, and then connect this color to the color. And now you can see the translucency effect. And to change the amount of this translucency, you can add a hue saturation node. And now when you change this value, the amount of translucency changes. And to see what this node is doing, I'm gonna preview this node by holding Ctrl Shift and left clicking on that. And when you decrease this value down, it gets darker, and when you increase that, it gets lighter. So the amount is a little bit high, so I'm gonna decrease it down to 0.6, and that's looking good. So now I'm gonna add a color name, and I'll pick some random greenish colors, some dark green and some yellowish green. Then I'll add an object info node and I'll connect the random to this factor value. And if you hold down shift and right click and drag over these lines, you can connect the lines at one point, and you can move this point by pressing G. And to mix these two nodes, you can hold down shift control, right click and drag from this to this, and now it adds a mix RGB node and plugs these into the color 1 and color 2 socket. But it's the opposite. I want this to the bottom and I want this into the color 1, so I'm gonna just move this to the bottom and it goes to the top by itself, and change the blend type to hue. And now each individual leaf will have a random color, and you can see the effect more clearly if I increase this value. Something like this is good. And if I pick some weird colors, you can see what it's doing, but I don't want that, so I just right click to cancel it. And for the stem material, I didn't find any textures, so the best way to make that is to make it procedurally. So that means we have to make that by using the nodes in the shader editor. So let's make a new material and rename that to stem. And before making the material, do use references because they'll help a lot, and you'd know how's the color and how's the surface reflecting. And I'm using PureRef if you don't know. So let's start by adding in a noise texture. I'm gonna hide the overlays for a second. Then you can press Ctrl T to add a mapping and a texture coordinate node. Then I'm gonna preview the node, and now I'm gonna plug this object into this vector instead of generated. I'm gonna move this to over here, and you can see how's the noise texture looking. I'm gonna scale up the noise texture to about 50. Then I'm gonna change this X scale value so that the texture is squashed on the Z axis, something like this. Then I'll duplicate the noise texture and the mapping node, and then I'll connect this object to the vector.
Vector! That's me.
And for this noise texture, decrease this X scale value down, so like it's squeezed on the X-axis, something like this. Then I'm gonna increase the scale to about 250 to make these dots smaller. Then I'm gonna mix these two together, and for the blend type I'm gonna set that to multiply, and now it's multiplying these two colors by this factor value. and I'm gonna increase that to something like this. Then I'll add a mix RGB node, and I'll pick two colors. First I'm gonna pick a yellowish green, something like this. Then I'm gonna increase the value something like this, and for the second one I'm gonna set that to a darker green color, something like this. Then I'll plug this into the factor, and now when we preview this, and you can see much because the effect is subtle. So I'm gonna move this to over here. Then I'm gonna add a color ramp. Then I'll preview the color ramp, and I'll move this slider to the left so it's brighter. And now wherever these white values are, our second color will be over there, and it's looking good. And now I'm gonna add a color ramp. Then I'll again pick some greenish random colors. Then I'm gonna add an object info node, and I'll connect the random to the factor. Then mix these two together and change the blend type to hue, and I'll increase the factor. But you can't see random colors because we have only applied the material to the single stem. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna select all these stems and branches, and if these empties are also selected, don't worry because it doesn't matter because they don't have any material. Then I'll select this last and then press Ctrl L, then link the materials, and all of these will have the same material. And you can see the random colors. I'm gonna move these over here, and to make these vertical lines that you see here on the stem, I'll add a wave texture. Then I'll duplicate this mapping node, and I'm gonna connect the object to the vector. Then connect the vector to the vector and set the scale back to 1, and now preview the node. And the lines are horizontal but we want them to vertical, so you can change this from X to Y, and now these are vertical. And then increase the scale to something like 20. Then I'm gonna increase the distortion a little bit, something around 1.2. And these waves are looking bad at the sides, but just forget about that. Then I'm gonna mix this with this node, and I'm gonna change the blend type to multiply, and then I'm gonna decrease that down to something around 0.3. And now we have these lines, and in the references you can see that these have small little brown dots. So to make that, I'm gonna again add a noise texture, and then connect the object to the vector. And we don't always need to add a mapping node. Then I'm gonna increase the scale to 30, and then I'm gonna increase the roughness a little bit, around 0.7, and increase the detail a little bit. Don't increase that too much because it will use more memory, something around 3. Then I'll mix this last node with this node, and instead of plugging this into the color 1, plug this into the factor and move this up. Then for the second color, pick a brown color, something like this. And this noise is too much, but decreasing down the scale won't help. But what we instead want is small dots but in few population. So what I'm gonna do is add a color ramp. Then I'm gonna move this to the right so that the white values are less. Then also move this one to the left so the white values are brighter, something like this. And now let's see how that looks. Then I'm going to change this blend type to overlay because that looks good, and you can play with this until you are happy. Something like this looks good. And now we have also these small little dots, and to make this type of dark brown thing at the bottom, I'm going to add an image texture. Then I'm going to open up an image texture that looks like this. Then connect the object to the vector, and I'm going to change the color space to non-color data because it's a black and white image texture. Then add a mapping node and connect this over here, and it's looking stretched on the y-axis, so I'm going to increase the y scale value something around 2. And we don't want this image texture all over the stem, but we want that at the bottom. So to do that, I'm going to add a gradient texture. I'm going to move these over here. Then I'm going to add a mapping node and connect this over here and connect the object to the vector. Then I'm going to preview the gradient texture, and it looks something like this, and change the X location value until you get a different color at the bottom. And now mix these together and change the blend type to multiply and increase the factor all the way up. And this is the opposite. We want the image texture at the bottom, not at the top, and that's happening because the black color is at the bottom, but we want white color at the bottom. So what I'll do now is, this is set to -1, so change that to +1, and these scale values are in positive, so we have to change that to -1. You can hold down left click and drag these three values, and now you can change these three values at once. So I'll set that to -1, and now the white color is at the bottom and the black color is at the top. And I'll also increase the X location so the white color is a little bit high. And now the image texture is at the bottom, and this one is inverted. I don't know why, but we'll fix that later. So what I'll do now is, first I'll move these over here, then I'll add a mix RGB node, and I'll plug this into the factor. Then I'll choose a reddish brown color, something like this, and the effect is very subtle, so I'm gonna add a color ramp, then plug this into here. And now I'm gonna move this to the left so it's brighter. I'm gonna move this to the left a little bit, and now let's see. And now you can see that, and now you can see the effect, and change the blend type to overlay, and that's a little bit darker. So I'm gonna make this white value a little bit darker, something like this. Maybe a little bit brighter, something like this. And I'll decrease this hue value a little bit down, something like 0.6. And these are looking greener, but we wanted them to be brown. So what I'll do is, I'll just copy this color by hovering the mouse over this and pressing Ctrl C, and I'll press Ctrl V, and that's looking better. And I'll make this white color a little bit brighter, just a little bit. And you can move your mouse over the shader editor and press Ctrl space to zoom into full screen. And now let's organize these so it's not that confusing. I'm gonna move this over here, and I'm gonna merge this at a point. I'm gonna move this over here, and now select these nodes which we use to make the green color pattern. this one and this one. And now you can press Ctrl J to make a frame, and now you can move the frame, and all the nodes inside it will also move with that. And I'm gonna rename that by pressing F2, and I'll change that to green color pattern. And you can also give this frame a color by opening up the sidebar by pressing N and enabling color, and now we can choose a color. And now let's frame the nodes so that it's organized. Then press Ctrl J. I'm gonna rename this to vertical lines, and you can also change the size of the text from here so it's bigger. And I'm gonna select this one. I'll frame this, and I'll rename this to small little dots. I'll move this to over here, and then I'll select these and I'll frame this again, and I'll rename this to bottom dart typing, and I'll increase the text size. And now that's much cleaner than before. And what I'll do now is mix all these black and white textures together and plug that into the roughness socket. So let's add a mix RGB node. Then I'll plug this into the bottom socket and this one into the first socket. And let's preview that. I'll change this to multiply, and that's good. And now I'll duplicate that, and now I'll connect this to the bottom socket, and instead of multiply I'm gonna set that to add, so that it just adds the second color to the first color. Now I'll duplicate that again, and now I'll plug this one into the bottom socket, and now I'll set that to multiply, and now plug the color into the roughness socket, and let's see how that looks. I'm gonna go to rendered view, and you can change the HDRI to see how that looks in a different lighting. And what I'll do now is add a color ramp, and now I'm gonna move this to the left, and I'll make that a little bit darker, something like this, and I'll move this one to the right, and I'll make that brighter a little bit, something like this. I'm gonna move this over here, and now let's see how that looks. So now let's add the bump node, and now plug this color into the height and this normal to the normal, and that's too much, so I'm going to decrease that down to 0.2, and now it's looking pretty good, but it looks hard. So what I'll do is I'll increase the subsurface scattering to 0.1, and I'll plug the same color to the subsurface color. And subsurface scattering is when the light passes through a translucent object, giving the glow type of effect. And this one's brown patches is at the top, so let's fix that. So I'm gonna select that, and I'll duplicate the material by pressing this button. Then I'll rename that to stem inverted, and now I'll go to the gradient texture, and in the mapping node I'll invert these values. I'll set this one to negative 1.4, and I'll set this one to 1, and still we can't see. So I'm gonna preview the gradient texture, and I'm gonna increase this a little bit, and now let's see, and now it's at the bottom. and also we don't want these brown patches for these branches. So what I'll do is I'm gonna select this branch and I'll make a new material again, and I'll rename that to branch, and I'll rename that to branch. And now before deleting these nodes, let's see where this is connected to. And this is connected to this node, so select this node, then delete this node by pressing Ctrl X, so that it deletes the node but it keeps the connection. And also delete this node by pressing Ctrl X, and now we can delete this whole section. And now I'll select all the branches, then I'll select this branch the last, then press Ctrl L and link the materials. And now all the branches will have the same material of this branch. And for the soil, I'm gonna make a new material and I'll rename that to part soil. Then I'll select the principal BSDF, then hit Ctrl Shift T to add a principal texture setup. Then browse the texture. I'll select this one, and now select the color, normal, and the glass map. Then click on this button and it will add the principal texture setup by itself. And now it's looking pretty good. And one setting that you can change right now to spice up your render is to go to the render properties and go down to the color management, and the look is set to none, but change that to high contrast and it immediately gets better. And that's it for the tutorial, guys, and in the upcoming parts I'll show you how you can create these two plants. And if you find this video helpful, give it a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and the bell down below so you won't miss any of my new videos. I'll be back.